Good evening. I'd like to call the Planning Commission meeting to order. This is our regular Planning Commission meeting. It's Thursday, June 7th at 6:30 p.m. and we are here in City Hall at Sammamish City Hall. We're in the City Council chambers. So I will start with roll call, and I'll start on my left tonight.
Roisin O'Farrell.
Shanna Collins.
Eric Brooks.
Jane Garrison.
And I believe we have Ratuja and Nupure on the telephone. Larry Crandall and Mark Boffman are absent this evening. So we do have, well, I guess we have 5 commissioners present. Ratuja on the phone. Hi, Ratuja.
Hello.
Okay, good. Can you hear us all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. So next item of business, approval of the agenda. I'll need a motion to approve the agenda tonight.
So moved.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the agenda. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Anyone opposed say no. And the agenda is approved 5-0. Next item of business is approval of the minutes, and these are the minutes from May 24th, 2018. It was the joint Planning Commission meeting with the Human Services Commission. I have one edit to make, and it's just at the very end. It's an adjournment. I think it says adjourn instead of adjourn. Where was this? I saw this last night. Okay, yeah, it's an adjournment, and it just says Eric Brooks moved to adjourn the meeting, so we just need to add an N. So, I move to approve the meeting. Are there any other amendments? I'm sorry. No? Okay. I move to approve the minutes from the May 24th, 2018 Planning Commission meeting as amended.
Second.
There's a motion and a second to approve the meeting minutes from the May 24th meeting. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed say no. Okay, and the minutes are approved 5-0. And the next item of business tonight is public comment. This is the non-agenda section of our public comment. Is there anyone who'd like to speak tonight on a non-agenda item? No? Okay. Anyone else? Doesn't look like it. Kevin, do we have list? I just want to make sure. I saw one name when I glanced, but it might be the agenda item. Good? Oh. Thank you. Okay, yes, we have Paul, but that's for agenda only. Okay, so the next item of business will be old business, and tonight we have this is a special meeting. Welcome, guests. We'll have a panel discussion on our housing strategy tonight. So this is actually work session number 5 for Sammamish Homegrown, and I spoke with Doug today, and I think the way we're going to do this is give the panel members a chance to give us some feedback on the matrix that they looked over on all of our housing strategies. Then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions if we have any. And what was the last piece? Can't remember.
I can go. I have a couple slides.
Okay, you have a couple.
So
Perfect. So with that, I'll hand it over to staff. Mr. McIntyre.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Collins and member of the Planning Commission. My name is Doug McIntyre. I'm a senior planner with the Department of Community Development here. And tonight's, as Chair Collins mentioned, is a little bit of a special meeting, and we have this congressional hearing style set up in the room, so it feels a little bit awkward. I apologize for that, but we really want it to be informal and engaging and really utilize the expertise at the table in front of us. So before I start, I just want to say thank you very much to all the panelists for attending and taking time out of your undoubtedly busy schedules. So this is going to be a really good discussion for us, not only staff, but also our commissioners as we progress with developing, identifying, and ranking strategies to address housing in Sammamish. So I always start these presentations off with just a really quick intro slide. And the purpose of our effort tonight, which we're somewhere getting toward the probably 75% range, maybe closer to 80% of completion as we work through Planning Commission and look toward City Council adoption. So the real effort here is to update our 2006 Housing Strategy Plan. We've identified that we want to bring our strategies into alignment with our current housing policy framework. Ultimately, the plan helps us transform our policies into actions. And that's particularly a good point for tonight's panel because this group in front of us really is where the rubber meets the road in the sense that we talk about the implementation actions and they're part of the implementation on the ground. So the intent is to learn tonight, to get some feedback from the experts in the field and help us to inform the strategies as we move forward. So just a real brief recap of the schedule. We've actually had to cut this slide down quite a bit because this reaches back to September of 2017. So this is a snapshot of where we've been recently. I think our May 24th meeting, the last joint meeting with our Human Services Commission, was a very productive discussion. I think we're now working pretty substantively toward a recommendation to City Council. So in mentioning that, I want to hit on the dates. So the July 5th date that you see at the bottom of that slide is our scheduled public hearing for this effort. And then we will likely use the July 19th regular meeting for deliberation and a vote. So we're getting pretty close to Planning Commission wrapping up the effort. And that's actually pretty exciting. And then when we get to City Council, it'll start in September and go through probably October, November. We'll see how that goes. Okay, so a lot to just get to the real meat here. But again, this is our housing industry panel. And really this is, we're calling it a panel, but it's one of our focus groups. It's just being done in a slightly different way than some of the other efforts will be done. So I want to take a moment to really quickly introduce them, and we will allow them to provide a little bit more detail about themselves. But we have Aaron Hollingberry with Toll Brothers, Jenna Estep with Murray Franklin, Steve Yoon with Mill Creek Residential, Tim Walter with King County Housing Authority, Rand Redlin of Homestead Community Land Trust, and Patrick Tippie of Catholic Housing Services. So a pretty broad range of developers and can get some good perspectives. So I do want to impress upon the commissioners that the information tonight will be part of leading us to the deliberations on the 5th and the 19th. So this slide is just a quick kind of representation of how we see commissioners using this information, one of the three kind of inputs into your deliberations in July, leading toward a recommendation. The other two, of course, being data and analysis that we've already talked about, and then the strategies matrix. Okay, so the way we envision this running tonight is to, again, just real quick intros, and then we'll have our panel, probably in a round robin format, just offer their thoughts on the list of strategies that has been circulated to them, either generally or more specifically, if they choose. And then we have a few prepared questions, which are on the next slide here. And then once we do that, we will open it up to the commissioners to allow them to ask questions about the experience and the input we're hearing. And then we'll do one final round of comments by the panel, and then quick wrap up and discussion on next steps. So should be pretty tight tonight. All right, so with that, then I will actually turn it over to the panel. And if maybe Jenna, if you'd like to start us off, give us an introduction, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go through the panel.
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for having the opportunity to share some information with you tonight. My name is Jenna Estep. I work for Murray Franklin Homes. Murray Franklin is a company that builds single-family residential, but we also build mixed-use, multifamily, so we're a pretty diverse builder. My personal background, I actually have worked for Murray Franklin only a year, so previous to that, I was actually a city planner for 20 years. I worked for the city of Snoqualmie through the development of the Snoqualmie Ridge from 98 to about 2006. And then I was the planning director for the city of North Bend for the last 10 years. So just recently decided to venture into the private sector side. So That's a little bit about me.
And my name is Patrick Tippy. I'm the Housing Development Manager at Catholic Housing Services. We build and operate housing all across Western Washington, from just north of Vancouver all the way up to Bellingham, from Redmond out to Forks. We own or operate a wide variety of affordable housing solutions, beginning at shelter, and we're developing shelter for homeless women and families in Kirkland, through senior housing, permanent supportive housing for homeless individuals, but we also do housing for workforce, the working poor, up to 60% AMI in both individual and household sizes, and our projects range anywhere from 10 to 110 units.
Good evening. My name is Aaron Hollenberry, and I work for Toll Brothers. We're a national public builder and developer. We range from high-rise for-sale product to apartments to single-family detached homes that we build across the nation. Locally here, we build about 400 homes a year, primarily in the single-family and townhome markets. We're looking for opportunities to bring more of the apartment living or high-rise living to this area. Right here in Sammamish, we've got 3 or 4 projects going right now that are either in Sammamish or in incorporated King County, and roughly 150 homes at some stage of development right now here in the city.
Good evening. My name is Rand Redlin. I am the Director of Real Estate at Homestead Community Land Trust. Homestead is the largest community land trust in the state of Washington. We have about 230 homes, and we provide affordable home ownership in King County and in the Seattle area. We're working on the east side, up in Shoreline, down in South King County. Our homes are provided to people who are usually in the 50 to 80% AMI. We develop them usually ourselves. We do some acquisition work. We usually are getting some form of a subsidy to drive the prices down so that people in the 60, 50, 80% range can afford them. This is workforce housing. This is your nurses, your police officers in that range. We've looked at some sites here in the area. And I also do some consulting work for some East Side nonprofits, Friends of Youth, who does youth housing and youth services. And I'm also working with Congregations for the Homeless on helping them site and develop the men's shelter and housing in the city of Bellevue.
My name's Steve Yoon with Mill Creek Residential Trust. It's not associated with the city, by the way. It's just the name of our company with roots actually in Texas, so pardon the confusion if there was any. We are a national developer of multifamily rental product. We do have a fairly sizable presence here in Puget Sound. Our focus is mostly all market rate developments, private developments. We're typically on the larger scale, so 100 units and up. We've had several projects in Seattle, a couple in the pipeline in Seattle. We've had some experience in Redmond, have a couple of projects lined up there. Have looked at various projects here in Sammamish. I am a Sammamish resident myself, so I have a real interest in finding out where the city is going. So if there's any questions about how a market rate developer is looking at, prospective site or development, or if it's affordability, be happy to share whatever market insights we have. We do, because we're operating in other jurisdictions, we do know what other people have done, and we have some opinions as to, what sometimes works well, what doesn't. And so if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Tim Walter, and I'm with the King County Housing Authority. I've been with the Housing Authority a little over 25 years, and I work I oversee our development, asset management, and construction for our new construction activity. King County Housing Authority is the housing authority that serves the county other than the city of Seattle and the city of Renton. Those two housing authorities work in their specific city jurisdictions. So King County Housing Authority would have jurisdiction in the rest of the county. We operate kind of three main programs. One is our Section 8 rental assistance program, which we provide rental assistance for about 12,000 households throughout the county. We have our public housing program, which is housing that is federally subsidized, but we own, operate, and manage that housing. And we have about 4,000 units of that housing that we own and operate. And then we have a program we call our kind of our workforce housing program, where we actually own around 6,000 units of housing that generally serves households more in the 50 to 80 or even 100% of median income. And that's the department that I oversee and work in the Housing Authority. So thankful that you're considering these things tonight. These are difficult topics, and we've seen a huge loss of affordability. Many people don't think about it, but the largest provider historically of relatively affordable housing is the private sector. It's private landlords who own and operate, generally speaking, multifamily or small or single-family homes that choose to rent to households at rents that are reasonably affordable. And we've seen a real loss of that, especially, over the last few years. So, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. So I think.
Wait, before you.
Thank you.
Okay, ready to go. So again, I think here our preliminary and kind of draft list of housing strategies has been circulated to the panel, and I think I'd like to first start off by just asking if there are any offerings that the panel would have for planning commissioners and staff. Takeaways, quick takeaways, high-level thoughts, or specific thoughts if you have any, and then do a. Yeah, and then after we do kind of one round of that, we have a list of questions on this next. Yeah, okay. I don't know if anyone. Do you want to just go left to right, right to left, or I'll open it up. Okay, then I guess I will ask maybe Jenna to start, if you don't mind. So if you have thoughts, you can start there. But we also have these 4 questions up here that we'd like, in some form or fashion, maybe for you to touch on. So first being, based on your experience, which items on the strategy list do you believe have best potential for supporting housing affordability at all economic levels and other needs, as well as community vitality in Sammamish?
Okay, thank you. Well, speaking from my past as a planner, I can tell you that every community basically in the King County area, if not state, is grappling with the same hurdle. It's a tough topic to address, especially within close proximity to where we are from our jobs. The land value in this area is high. So as you move forward through your process, note that there's many others kind of going through the same, and it's a difficult topic. As I read through your list of strategies, I felt that I kind of noted about 4 or 5 that I felt had the best potential to be successful. The first one I noted was just regional partners and thinking about affordable housing from a regional standpoint. Partnering with these people that actually are on the ground building the affordable product is a very successful way to do that. And I think that is a coordinated effort between the city, the property owners of your city, the developers, and then also the partner that you bring in that is potentially that affordable housing building expert. The next one I liked was your public land inventory. I always felt that cities missed the boat a little bit on utilizing their properties to the best of their ability, and sometimes even thinking about their properties in a multi-use standpoint. So a lot of times we build city halls and they just sit as a city hall. City halls can be second stories or 3 or 4 stories with affordable housing on top, or you know, a multitude of different creative ways to use public property more effectively is something I liked in your strategy. This one might be a little bit different for you, but definitely coming from a community that had homes that were built at the turn of the century. Preservation of your existing housing stock is another good avenue. People that are looking, first-time home buyers are willing to buy fixer-uppers and put sweat equity into it. So sweat equity is a great way to get into the housing, your first house. So thinking through your preservation of housing stock is a good thing to think about. And I think throughout here you had mentioned development standards and creating development standards that are provide you the high quality neighborhoods you want, but without these sometimes unnecessary costs do help. And it is very clear when you're not a large builder and you're a small time person where those development regulations really sting. And so really kind of looking at those and analyzing those and kind of evaluating the community character versus the need for those and adjusting as necessary. I think that answered my number one. You want me to go through each question? Or,
Sure,
okay.
if you could, or if you want to keep it more.
Let's go through each question first. Yeah, let's
Yeah,
go through
okay.
each question first by each person. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So based on my experience, I've been on the development team for everything from shelters all the way through the 50-60% affordability range. I'm not going to focus on the shelter solutions necessarily, but kind of begin at the 30% AMI, although I would like to just state for the record that there are homeless folks that live in every community, that come from every community, and the more that each community does work to address and provide some access to affordable housing either in their community or by growing their share to an arts trust fund or something like that, does go a long way of helping absorb and provide care for residents that do come from our individual communities. But on the, I guess going along, this can work for many of the different low-income segments. There's a couple strategies here that stuck out for me. Reduce parking requirements, whether that be code administratively amended or written into code. Many jurisdictions, Kent and Everett, have reductions for senior housing, and they also have reductions for homeless housing or for those that are covenant restricted below different AMI levels. So much as they have parking studies to demonstrate that, I think it's really important to bring the data to that. I think that experienced developers like Catholic Housing Services or King County Housing Authority or Imagine Housing would have the data and want to recommend the right thing because they want to keep their residents happy. All of us want to keep occupancy levels high and vacancy low, so turnover is no good because of various different reasons. But parking does drive a lot of costs. Similarly, utility connection and impact fee waivers is a huge tool that we've used in the city of Everett, in Bellingham, in Mount Vernon. That's something that really makes a large difference, particularly when we can demonstrate that there are going to be smaller households that may live in the units and may not be contributing to schools, or if they build amenity space on site and may not need to contribute to park impact fees. We've also been lucky enough to work with various public jurisdictions on surplus land from both governments, but also partnering with the faith communities, Catholic churches, Lutheran churches, any faith denomination, Christian or otherwise. There's a lot of land out there that can be used. We've seen some pretty successful tent cities that have operated, but also permanent solutions. And our shelter in Kirkland is on surplus church land in a partnership with the city of Kirkland that is going quite well. And then I guess the fourth is lending credit support for affordable housing, especially as interest rates begin to rise. The bonding capacity of cities can go a long way to buying down interest rates a little bit and being able to use rent that we're able to collect, but borrow money at a little bit cheaper rate to be able to get a little bit of a bump on the ability to attract capital into a project. Capital and debt, yeah.
So I have a little different take on things because we're really in the medium to high end of that housing affordability range with the single-family home market that we're in. But I think it's, what we're experiencing throughout the region right now is really a supply problem, and we've got issues with both supply and with cost, and that ends up affecting everybody as we're all competing to try to get into a home. And so from a private for-profit side perspective on things, it's really so that we can provide more homes. We're encouraged to invest more in homes in an area if we have predictability and if time can be reduced down on how quickly we can get to market. And that greatly impacts our ability to do more projects and to provide a more affordable home. So looking at it in that regard, the strategies of flexible subdivision standards to allow clustering, streamlining procedures and regulations so that we have both predictability in what's going to come out at the end when we go in to propose a project, and also for how quickly we can get through that process. Affordable housing incentives, that's a place that that encourages the private developer to participate in providing affordable housing and income-restricted housing in areas that we wouldn't otherwise. But that needs to come with things like density increases, flexible development standards, and I think what you have to do is you have to look at that closely to make sure it's a win-win situation to encourage the developers to actually participate in it. We see in a lot of jurisdictions these things get rolled out, and if the numbers don't work out, you end up with people not using it. And if you're going to develop a strategy and develop it into actually regulation, you don't want it to just sit there. Let's see, innovative housing options. We've got developments that we're doing right now where it's single-family zoned land that we're actually able to do cottage housing on in lieu of single-family homes, or traditional single-family homes. And with that, there are density bonuses so that we can provide more homes, but they're, instead of your traditional 2,500 to 3,500 square foot house that you'd have in a city like Redmond or Sammamish or Kirkland, you're providing a 1,200 square foot house, and you're providing more of them, providing a different type of housing option. So those were some of the key strategies I saw as being supportive.
I share some of the same ideas that we've talked about. I think we're blessed to have an ARCH organization on the east side. I'm a resident of Bellevue, longtime resident of the east side, and I see all that ARCH does in supporting affordability and housing in the area. I think the regional approach is much more effective than just going solo in the different cities. Also, approaching in a regional way is supporting organizations like Friends of Youth and CFH, where they're maybe not in your city, but they're in a local city, like the Men's Shelter will benefit all of the east side, even though it's in Bellevue. And with Sammamish supporting that, it helps the whole area, including their city. I think a better approach on a regional level where we here in the Northwest, and this has been going on a long time in my opinion, that we don't plan for the housing for what we're building in our offices and on our employment bases. And we're seeing Microsoft adding 5,000 new jobs, but we're not seeing 5,000 new homes being built to compensate for those increases. And I think we haven't done that for the last 30 years, and I was born and raised here, so I've seen that. I think we've also had a detrimental opinion of development in the Northwest, and I think that's not a good attitude to have. One thing that wasn't on the list, but we see it in our home ownership of affordability, is the ability to build condominiums without having the liability issues for the developers. There is a condominium law in the state of Washington that prohibits the development of affordable condominiums in the state of Washington because the liability laws are so stringent. The Board of Realtors, master builders are trying to get on board, but they feel that they could offer 8,000 units a year of affordable condominiums if the law was changed in the Puget Sound area. Some other things that are on the list, just general incentives for affordability, making incentives for private developers to add affordability units in theirs by getting higher density. I agree with Patrick on reducing parking, reducing impact fees for affordable units, providing higher densities. Homestead has looked at a church site here in Sammamish that has extra land. It's zoned that they could probably build 2 or 3 houses on it. Regular houses for Sammamish in that zoning, with I think a 5,000 square foot lot or a 3,500 square foot lot. We have done something similar to with the church in Tukwila, where we're taking a similar sized property and we're putting 11 cottage houses on it. They have a reduction of parking, 1 parking per house. The houses are 1,400 square feet. We're able to do a mixed income where some of them will be sold at close to 300, but some of them will be sold at 220. They'll be permanently affordable with the land trust. But having the flexibility to do that for affordability, especially in church surplus property, could be some. So those are some of the ideas to share.
So I read through this, and I have a couple more macro comments. Hopefully that's okay. So from I share some of the thoughts of my colleagues here. I think from my perspective, the challenge, what we have today is we got so much job, creation and people coming in from out of town, and it's left a void of affordable housing for those who need it. So I think the question is what specific, goal are we trying to get to? And maybe you guys have already talked about this, but is it 30%? Is it 50%? Is it 80%? Is it separate buildings, or is it a commingled building? And so I guess from my perspective, from the private sector and looking at a bunch of different developments, we see some goals that aren't as clear as what they could be, and that once you set something or it goes through council, it's really, really hard to unwind. And so, my general comment is, specifically, what does the city want? Is it a certain amount of units? Is it rental, for sale? Just the more specific, the better, because in my opinion, there are private developers who are in this little strata, then there's other developers in the lower strata as far as like scale. Then there's different, people who are in different sections of what they can do and what they can't do. It's very difficult for example, somebody like me, to do something at the 30% or the 50% AMI level, and I would imagine it'd be hard for someone at the 30%, 50% to do something at the market rate level. I am the topic that I guess I am passionate about is incentives for if part of this is a private development that wants to commingle sort of a market rate with an 80% AMI. I'm a big believer in the property tax exemption programs that are around. I don't know all the complications and the costs with that, but I see that as working in Seattle and other areas. because it provides an incentive for the developer, and it provides, somewhat of a long-term, and it commingles the market rate renter with the 50 or 80%, AMI renter, at, a percentage that makes it work. In the private development world, we look at a project and we figure out how much does it cost to build, and then we figure out the rents, and then we figure out, does this make the project viable or not? And so I would say, generally speaking, the more incentives to reduce costs helps, projects get done. Now, that being said, if the city is not specific as far as, 5% is this or 10% is this, it's very difficult for a private developer to just say, okay, we're going to do this. And so if there's some trade-off that says we'll give you this, but you do this, that typically is that typically works for most private developers. So I would encourage, if that is one of the goals, I would encourage some direction in that area. And maybe as a case study, you could say, okay, here's one, corner. If you were to visualize what that is from an affordability aspect, what is it? Is it, a home? Is it a dense project? Is it, mixed use? Is it a standalone? And so zoning and putting it into the books is very clear as to what, the city wants. And so I would advise some of those envisioning sessions where you could take a step back and say, we all want affordability, but what does that mean? And so just being more specific and creating some incentives.
Thank you.
So again, just a couple of real quick things. One is that I'd encourage you to think long-term as it relates to affordability and not just short-term. If we were to look back 15 or 20 years, what would those things that we wish our predecessors would have done so that today, we'd be enjoying the benefits of those? So for a King County Housing Authority, where we've gone out and in an attempt to preserve housing, a lot of the workforce type housing, just your typical renter in your Class B apartment, many who are getting priced out of their own home today in their apartment, we wish we had bought a whole lot more apartment complexes 15 and 20 years ago, because today we'd have their mortgages paid down 15 to 20 years worth, and we don't have to raise rents the same as the private sector does. We have to raise rents to cover our costs of operating, but we'd have a significant larger portfolio of property that would be affordable to folks today. And so what are those things that in 15 or 20 years from now, folks that are sitting in your seat had wished that people would have done today and made some of those hard decisions? And it's, it's things we hear a lot about: incentives. What are incentives? But what things may need to be mandatory? And so there are hard decisions that, are made or need to be made, but I'd really encourage you to think about 20 years from now, what are those things that would actually make a difference? And also there's a zillion great ideas, but a lot of them really just nibble around the edges. And so if you're really going to focus on some things, what are those things that may actually make some really substantial, impacts? And I think that leads right into, I really focused more on your housing supply part of it, because if you want to have housing choice at a lot of different affordability levels, you need to have a whole lot more housing. And that's the only way to get it. And you're not going to accomplish that through your single-family homes. And the market will dictate with the single-family homes what those price points are, and they're going to serve a very narrow but an important part of the market. And you're not going to do it with duplexes and triplexes. So really there needs, to really address this issue, I think there needs to be a significant increase in the amount of rental product, and not your lifestyle product. You hear a lot about, with all the costs of building, people are having to build in a lot of bells and whistles that will attract people that can pay the cost per square foot, that they need to rent it out to cover all their costs. But the most affordable rental housing today is your Class B product that's 15 and 20 years old. And that's what the market owns, and that's the most affordable housing that the private sector provides. So in 15 or 20 years from now, it's going to be the stuff that's built today. So increasing the level of supply of housing that serves a more kind of moderate bracket. People who are at 30% and below with a voucher can have access to housing. People who are at your 50% may have income can double up as, renters and can get a 2-bedroom apartment. People at 80% of AMI and some of your more reasonable apartment complexes can pay a market rent, which is close to 80%. Your people at 100% who've come out of school and have decent jobs but or have a baggage of school debt, have a place to live while they work through that debt. And people that are 120% of median and above can have a place to live while they save for a house. So I think your modest or your rental product that's not your high-end lifestyle type apartments, a significant increase in the supply of that kind of housing today will give you the greatest opportunity to address, a broad spectrum of folks. And over the next 15 to 20 years, will provide a level of product that will be a significant portion of the affordable housing that this community will have wished it had. So,
Thank you.
Might take a quick second to jump in here. I think the panel, just for the benefit of the commissioners, I think the panel is doing a good job of hitting on all the 5 categories that we're talking about. A mix of affordability, supply, character, regional collaboration, and senior housing came up. So I think just continue to reframe it that way. And then before we go to the second round, I just want to maybe suggest that we combine questions 2 and 3 into this round. I think that they kind of go hand in hand pretty well. So I'll stop talking now and maybe turn it over for Jenna to go ahead. Thanks.
You know what? Wait, Doug, let's pause. I just wanted to ask the commissioners if there's any questions from that first round. Because there were a lot of good nuggets there. Anybody have any questions?
I did have, sorry.
Oh, I hear Rituja has something. Rituja?
Yeah. Thank you, Shanna. I think, there was a comment made about thinking long-term strategies. And I know a few examples were given, but I was wondering if we could come up with a checklist somewhere, or if there were more criteria that we could think at for Sammamish, given that, most of our land is already used up for construction, or, we have buildings there. And one of the challenges that I see, it seems so daunting right now with the supply being so limited, and, thinking about just affording homes for our teachers and firefighters and policemen. What else can we be thinking about for Sammamish, especially, if we still want to think long-term, but without the influence of the market forces?
Rituja, it was a little bit hard to hear. Did anybody catch? I didn't catch the first part, Rituja, which I think was your actual question.
Okay, so basically it's, one of the suggestions was made that, cities have not thought long-term. And I want to understand, is it too late to think long-term now? And how do we think long-term with the ups and downs of the market that are going on right now?
Does anybody want to answer that?
I think one of the things that you see is that over time, in order to address housing, areas become more dense. And there's a lot of pushback, and you see Seattle where there's been single-family neighborhoods that now they have 6-story apartment buildings that they put in there, and there is a lot of resistance. But in 15 and 20 years from now, those will be very important neighborhoods that house 15 times more people than they house right now.
Right.
And so the land is taken up, but land is taken up everywhere, and it becomes the density. And so that becomes, there's just very few, I mean, when you just look back and look at it, if you're going to house more people and have those housing options, how do you stay ahead of the curve around density? And people come to learn how to live with it, but it's not comfortable when it starts.
I have to agree 100%. I think his comments are spot on, and you can do 1 or 2 or 3, little residents here, but the real sort of lift is if you could, lift the density to do, floors of development. And so it can get prickly, right? Because neighbors and density and heights and shadows and all that. But I would entirely agree if we really want to make a movement, it's an incentive to put 1 or 2 floors of additional residential, at certain affordability levels without penalizing the developer. I agree 100%. I think it's a great idea.
Does anyone have any ideas for making it easier? I mean, are there any things we could have done in the past to make people more comfortable with more density?
15 or 20 years from now, or from before, had you had more 200 and 300 unit apartment complexes that were built here, maybe 8 or 9 of them, you'd have 2,000 more units of housing today. And I don't think then there would have been any easy discussion about allowing that type of, density in a product. So I think these are part of the challenge is have that honest and open discussion.
And I think earlier you said something about mandating versus incentivizing, which would mean, mandating higher density so that we can
Mandating higher
build the
density,
supply.
mandating affordability.
Yeah.
These are things that are difficult to do, but as they get done, and as they get done slowly, people see how they get done. And then people can build on that success.
And they can be done right in neighborhoods, where you create neighborhoods with density, where they become desirable places to live, where you have, amenities you can walk to. Maybe you have to travel outside for work, but maybe you're in a dense area that creates a community. I mean, you're seeing neighborhoods like Ballard become a lot more desirable because they are creating density, and restaurants are coming in because they are supported by the density and the stores and the retail and stuff. So it's a matter of how you do it too.
I think that's a big part of it too. Density, there's quaint spaces usually are tight spaces, and so density isn't a bad thing. It's just sometimes we resist it. And I remember I was at a public hearing once, and this gal in North Bend, she was in her 90s, and she came in, and she was the last person to speak on a development that was over 150 homes. And she told, got up and said her name and said, she was born here, and she was 90-some years old, and if when she went out to the barn, she shut the gate, none of us in here would be here to debate this topic. And I think that's an important thing to remember is as you add people to your community, you're always going to have the resistance from the people that are currently here. And to kind of talk to the question on the phone, you're doing your long-range planning. You are thinking ahead right now. Affordable housing is going to be for you a menu of items, not just one. Density helps, incentives helps. Working with property owners helps, but in the end, it's really a magnitude of bringing them all together to create a perfect or a viable package, So to kind of go to your question on how do you make it more tolerable to accept density, I actually think it's more about knowing that there's always going to be that resistance and trying to bring people along to understand why density doesn't have to necessarily, or that it's going to happen, change is going to happen, and that's a difficult conversation to have.
One question I have is multi-use. I'm very interested in bringing some other uses, mixed use, into our suburban areas. And we have vast amounts of suburban area. Just huge amounts of land that is a one dwelling unit per acre, even though it's zoned 4. And now maybe it's going to go up to 6, I'm not sure. So they have examples of what 4 looks like, and they don't like it. It's very car-oriented. So people don't like it, but I was wondering if bringing services in to those existing neighbors would be appealing, and if it works, if it could be successful. I've seen many cases where it isn't successful, and I'm even thinking of a place like Mercer Island, where they brought retail in on the ground floor, and who goes in there but an accountant? It doesn't generate traffic. Nobody else wants to go there. The space is too small. It doesn't have any obvious parking. It's just not there for them. So I'm just trying to see how to get over that hurdle in suburbia.
Go ahead.
Yeah, that's a real challenge because you see it you saw it up at Snoqualmie Ridge as they needed to get 2,000 homes up there before you could finally get a grocery store or a restaurant up on top of the hill. And what happens is if you don't have the concentrate, and that's still a car-oriented development up there, so it's not a direct, well, you're seeing it in Bothell right now. They've gone through a significant rezone there, but people are living in these apartments in 6-story buildings, and they're keeping their cars because they don't have a grocery store there yet, and they don't have a place to go, and you're not getting those retail elements there yet because you don't have the doors yet to support it. That follows along once you get the doors, and if you don't have the density that you need, you're not going to be able to get, well, it points towards what you were talking about earlier, where you need to have higher densities, and in the 4 to 6, you might not be getting to a point where you're not going to create a walkable community out there in those suburbs. I think it's going to be really hard because you're just not going to be able to get the retail drawn out there. They're not going to have enough people to come to it. But with the town center concept, that gives you the critical mass that you need. So hopefully here you're starting to see it happen here in the city.
I think if you layer in density, which is attractive to retail, but you also layer in some transit-oriented type of mechanism for people to go there and it's walkable, I think that's the best way to go. I think if things are sort of status quo on the density, it would be very hard to accomplish what you are visioning. And I don't wish to say that, but I think that's the reality, the economic reality.
Okay, I give up.
Well, I also think I might add, density is a big one, but we started zoning cities where we have commercial, residential, and we stopped allowing the mix of residential with compatible commercial. So we got away from walking down to the small little pop shop to get your milk and your coffee and walking back home. Now, if you want to typically, if you want to go do anything from a commerce standpoint, you're going to be driving about a mile or two, and that's not a walk for a lot of people. So sometimes having those small little strategic corners, not necessarily right in your heart of town where a small little coffee shop can locate, you create those third spaces that serve an area that might only be about 1,000 people or 2,000 people, but it's enough to keep that small 300 square foot little space going. So being creative in what you consider commercial, it doesn't always have to be associated with a large commercial aspect.
I also think when you're sizing your commercial, incentivizing not the large commercial spaces. A lot of developers in kind of the suburban cities like the large retail commercial spaces because you can find one commercial tenant, a Walgreens or a CVS or something that takes it, and it's easy for developers because that tenant is an easy person to underwrite when you're getting your financing together. But creating small enough spaces that small business owners and micro businesses can get started with, it might be a little bit harder for developers to underwrite that space because you don't know who's going to be there. Those tenants don't have business plans that they can go to the bank with to underwrite 24 months before lease up starts, but creating small enough spaces so that way people who live and work here can continue to work here and create their new businesses and thrive in a more local economy, which I think then starts creating a little bit more walkability and symbiosis between the local business owners.
I worry that the business can't make it. I worry that there seems to be a lot of failure anyway. When you see a very small business, it doesn't last, and they go under over and over again. So I have that concern.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question. Okay. Okay.
It's not on. Mention that, the order.
So you want to combine 2 and 3?
Suggestion. I think this is a great discussion. I'm really encouraged by the discussion. But yeah, I think maybe 2 and 3 kind of go hand in hand in my opinion. So just throwing that out there.
Okay. Should we start here this time? I'm sorry. Is it? I can barely see. Is it
It's
Tim or
Tim.
Tom? Tim. Okay. Go ahead.
You can call me Tom, though. I'll still,
Okay.
still answer. I didn't see anything, again, that caused me concern in your list of strategies. It was just, again, a caution that a lot of time and effort can be put into things that don't yield a lot of results. So really be thoughtful about, as you're looking at your strategies and spending time on them, what are the ones that are really going to make a difference so that in 15 and 20 years from now, there is some meaningful outcomes that came out of the decisions you're making today. In terms of, are there other strategies or ideas missing from the list? I would just, as kind of context, I would really hope that as you're looking at this, that think of those things that in the community really create a culture of inclusivity, not exclusivity. And as that really comes through, kind of mixed income communities are very rich communities, where you're having folks who are working at the coffee shop and your teachers, you know, living close to the folks that are making $500,000 a year somewhere else, and your kids are playing soccer together, and it's not kind of this not in my backyard kind of attitude. And I think also these need to be real priorities, not just good discussion and good, you know, some good thoughts, but what does it take to get a Trader Joe's or a Metropolitan Market in a suburban area where you really are planning density of, you know, 4 or 5 story buildings right there? Things that you haven't done in the community that really take, you know, some planning to do. And just again, these will be hard decisions, not easy decisions in terms of what it's going to take. Like you said, how do you get there?
Yeah.
You know, that's something that you guys know best and will know from your community of what it takes to get the buy-in. One thing that just to put out there, again, that it's very likely in the way things have been going, especially in King County, you know, someone brought up again about jobs, but housing is where jobs go to sleep at night. And with all the jobs that are built or that are created, without there being an equal amount of housing, if not more housing, then it's just supply and demand and going to continue to push the cost of housing up at an accelerating rate. And so how are there strategies also around preservation? And again, that's something where King County Housing Authority has worked very hard at acquiring 100. We look at apartment complexes that again are more of your Class B 100 to 300 unit apartment complexes. But those are ones that we acquire or try to acquire so that the folks that are living there at the time we acquire the building can continue to live there. You know, the retired office manager at the local dental office who's just getting her pension, but pretty soon we're seeing the rent be more than 50% of her income, and her income's not changing. These are the folks that are living in some of the rental properties now what needs to happen so those folks will continue and be able to have a home that they can live in here. So would encourage you to think about supporting the idea of entities such as the Housing Authority or other nonprofit folks acquiring existing housing. Often acquiring existing housing is more cost effective than developing new housing. But finding ways to acquire and own existing housing so that there can be that ownership that helps keep things affordable over time. And also to consider ideas. Arch is kind of on the cutting edge in a lot of ways of some different housing ideas where there's public-private partnerships, where Arch will work with a nonprofit, or in our case with the Housing Authority, and we may on a single site build in a condo type structure, not individual condominiums, but 2 condominium buildings, where we will have one building that is maybe leveraging the low-income housing tax credit program, which serves people who are your teacher income, your 60% of area median income folks, right next door to another building that's a market rate building, but the product looks very close, so it's a very integrated community, but you're getting a broad range of affordability, you know, throughout the community. So there's lots of things like that that can be done. We'd just like to encourage you to, whether they're explicitly stated or not, you know, are things that are able to be done through your strategies.
Tim, can I get you to define what you mean when you say Class B housing?
So Class B housing, I don't know that there's a definition, you know, per se, but it's going to be your more modest type rental product that, you know, maybe there's 1 swimming pool, not 3, no, you know, entertainment, you know, building in the community center, just more of your basic type apartment that has your, you know, typical amenities that folks would like, you know, parking and washer dryers, but they don't have to all be marble countertops and stainless steel refrigerators and a bellman at the door.
It's non-luxury.
Yep.
Thank you.
Could I ask a question? I don't want to talk too much. I'm worried about preservation because I don't think we have much to preserve. I think that's what we've been told, that there's not much that's very old out there. So as people age and have to move out of their 1 dwelling unit per acre house, what we're thinking about are ADUs. And I'm wondering, accessory dwelling units, and I'm wondering if anybody doing public housing is interested in things that small.
No.
For affordability. Is that too little?
It's not, I mean, it's a great tool to have so that you would encourage people to have people live, you know, on the same property, but you're essentially going from 1 unit to 2 on an acre. You know, so the question becomes, how do you get those 2 or 3 or 4 acres that all have 1 home on them and get 150 units on them? So again, accessory dweller units are good, and they're a good tool to have, and it's also a way, I think, to handle aging in place, because often there can be a family member who lives in the accessory unit that is able to provide support that way. So, but I don't think it solves the larger issue that you've talked about. But again, even with preservation, stuff that's built today, if you build stuff in scale, will be those resources that in 15 years from now, 18 years from now, are going to be some of the most affordable stuff that the city has available to folks as an option.
Thank you.
So on the strategies on the list, I guess my general comment is that there are a number of items on here, and I touched up on this at the beginning. I think if the city sort of narrows in on, you know, are we trying to deal with 20 units, or are we trying to deal with 2,000 units, or, something of that, I think it'll inform which one of these are real and which ones aren't. And so some of these are targeted just really big and bold. The other just, I think someone said, it nibbles around the edges. So it really sort of depends on the scale of what the city wants to do. So I guess my general comment is to narrow this list. And then also, like I had mentioned before, it's the affordability levels, right? Do you want to go for that workforce 80% range? Do you want to go for the 30%, the 50%, and then what quantities? And I think that will inform, and narrow down all the lists on this page. I really believe that. And it'll also simplify things and make things easier. One thing missing, I think I mentioned to you before, that the property tax exemption works in Seattle from my perspective. I don't hear everything on the public sector, but it definitely works, knowing that half our projects are done that way. And it does commingle, I think it's a 50% and a 80% in a market rate development. In the city of Redmond, just for example, in that jurisdiction, the city says, okay, you can do a certain percent. Arch is familiar with this. They can share a lot of information, but they, there's a certain percent. It's not a huge percent, but there's a certain percent that are in each development, which is fairly dense. And so, that's another way to do it. It's less incentivized than Seattle, but it still seems to work given the smaller percentages. I guess I want to leave you maybe with one example of a missed opportunity. I may get in trouble for saying this, but I think, I found out about a month ago that, the church, along, Squaw Pine Lake Road, that was on the market.
Oh, is that Eastridge?
Yeah, on Eastridge. And, I had found out that the zoning didn't allow for multifamily. And it would have been perfect, to be honest with you. It could be garden style, it could have been, a low mid-rise or something. And there's apartments right there.
Right.
To me, it made logical sense. It could have been, it's a large enough site where it could have been, mixed with some affordability, and it's along a trail, I guess you can call it. But I would encourage, if there's any, I don't know if you guys have probably done this, get a map and figure out where those little zones are where you can zone it. And it might not happen today, but maybe at some point 5, 10, 15 years down the road, it can, and you've done your a successful job, in my opinion. Even these dwellings where they're not dense, they don't have to move. But at some point when they move and they're going to get a land value for their grandkids and stuff, they might actually think it could be an okay option. That's just my opinion.
It's helpful. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? And this may be a terribly naive one, but I'm sure you'll let me know. When you're a private developer and you're looking at a piece of land that you want to develop and put in housing, when you're trying to decide what type of housing you're going to build there, is it purely a zoning question? Or is it driven by what the market will bear? So what I'm saying is it purely the zoning of that land that you will decide, oh, this is single family homes we're going to build here, or oh, this is going to be multi-use? Is that the only thing that makes your mind up, or are there other things that would change your mind as to when you purchase a piece of land, you might say, oh, we thought we were going to build single family homes here, but no, we're actually going to build condos, or we're going to build townhouses? Is that purely a zoning decision? Is that what drives your decision as to what you build on a piece of land?
You want to go first? Well,
And if that's a
I'll answer
silly
that for him.
question, that's okay, but it's something that I've been curious about.
Honestly, the first thing that we look at is the zoning and what the allowed uses are under that zoning. And then the second thing that we're doing is if we're going to be able to invest in the piece of ground, we need to be competitive. And so we're going to run our internal analysis on what we think the highest and best use is for the property, given what our skill sets are and where we think we can get to the most value for that piece of property. And that's really the basics of what our approach is So I think zoning has a lot to do with
Okay.
it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would say he's probably unique and he can straddle different product types, which is good. I wish I had that flexibility, but I would say most private developments don't have that flexibility. Like we can only do market rate. We can maybe dabble in senior, but we aren't good at it. We can maybe dabble in affordable, but we're not good at it. We cannot do for sale. And so I would say there are a few people who can do maybe one or two, but it's not like developers have this, we can do whatever
You should
we want.
practice more with the affordable and you'll get better at it.
I probably should. I'm trying to, but I can't.
Yeah, and like I said, I think exactly that, my comment about skill set, there's some products that we're not very efficient at, and so that's why you'll see us go in one direction rather than another.
Okay.
But normally with the zoning, you don't have that much latitude.
Okay. All right, thank you.
So I think one of the greater concerns is that you have such a big list here that it's hard to focus, and you just might be doing a lot of little things that nibble around the edges, as it was said. I don't see a large focus on affordable home ownership, in my opinion. That's a little bit harder of a niche, but I think it creates, a better community. I think, as I mentioned before, condominiums allow for that lower-priced affordability in home ownership, and it also allows for those who are aging out of their homes to go into something smaller and maybe less expensive, but still stay in their neighborhood. A couple things that I think make a difference, like with the ADUs, if you are going to be serious about that, your permit cost should be practically nothing. You should have no parking requirements for that ADU unit. You should even allow non-owner occupied landlords to build ADU units if you're going to be serious about making a dent with an ADU approach. There's a lot of good things in here, reducing parking requirements, increasing the FAR in development projects, providing the incentives. I think we've talked mostly about that. And getting to your one question about what we look at as an affordable developer, whether it's for affordable home ownership or for affordable rental, we also have to look at what subsidies or what kind of financing that the nonprofits are allowed to use. And that would kind of dictate what we can build on a surplus land or on a piece of property.
I think you've got a fairly comprehensive list of strategies. I guess to build on a comment Rand made earlier, or a couple times now, the condominium issue is a big issue. There are a lot of, especially your smaller builders, are not able to use condominiums because of the cost of or inability to get insurance with the way the Condominium Act is set up right now. I'm fortunate in that the company that I work for is big enough that we can make the decision to get in that or not. So we're able to do some condominiums, but as soon as you get up to 8 units or more per acre, it is a great tool to be able to produce for sale ownership housing. And so that's something that unfortunately the trial lawyers have a big influence at the state level and have kept that from being something that could actually get modified and get to be something that is more reasonable and is something that more of the market can use. So,
Thank you.
I don't think there's any bad strategies in the list. I echo what's been said at the other end of the table is taking a look at the strategies, identifying, I've been all day, as I've been kind of looking at these, I've been thinking about a policy analysis course that I took and just making an evaluation matrix of impact, what target areas we're trying to do. So maybe identify, are we looking at 30, 50, 80, 120, magnitude of impact, and focusing on one or two solutions for each of those. And really being bold. I don't think it's ever too late to plan for the future. There's always going to be a future. So be bold, think about how this will impact 20 years from now, and it may take 2 or 3 or 7 years for new construction starts to really hit, because it takes people time to get things built into our models, to think about how that might work. We're all, you know, as other folks said, you know, we're good at one or two little things, and it might take us a little while to calibrate to what the flavor of development that Sammamish is incentivizing or is envisioning for itself. There could also be particular market struggles or market impacts that might not make that strategy work this instant, but once we go through another business cycle, it might be a great strategy in creating a lot more ownership. So I really encourage picking what targets are and then naming specific policies to address those targets. And I think that a multi-phased, I'm a large proponent of everything and a solution for every one of those, because there's a need for housing at every income segment, and people live in this community that earn all income segments. So taking a look at all of them and finding one or two bold approaches to incentivize development in each of those areas.
I think I would add to this that to always be looking at your development regulations. Right now, a lot of development regulations, out of response to development and growth, is to increase them. And what happens with that is we're developing land like land is completely plentiful, and it really won't be. So keep in mind when you're putting together your street standards and the things that become permanent features that, you know, you might be able to redevelop the Safeway Center at some point, but the infrastructure is pretty permanent. And so keep that in mind, because the one lesson I've learned being on the government side is when the government goes to build a project, if you can't afford your own development standards, your development standards are out of line. And that happens a lot. Cities find themselves trying to figure out how to budget for a street improvement or a city hall construction, and it's partly because they can't, you know, the sidewalks, curb gutter, planter strip sidewalks, all the infrastructure costs are so great that they start figuring out different ways to phase it. So that's a way to kind of think about how costs really affect development and opportunity for the less privileged developers or homeowners. And so that would be my only other thing to leave you is also, as you're thinking through this, instead of maybe just focusing on the nonprofits and the developers, think of your existing property owners and how they can stay and be successful in changing times. King County taxes went up quite a bit this year. So your property owners, they're either going to have to be able to afford that increase, sell to one of us, or move on, you know, and move on. So having incentives or abilities to have the ADU placed on their backyard, and you know, a lot of homes now are 5-foot sidewalks on both sides, so you can't, you know, you have to allow an ADU where somebody's going to use the side yard to get to the backyard that is currently inaccessible. So being really creative like that to find ways for current homeowners to age in place and stay.
Any questions about what we just heard? No? Okay. Rituja, anything to add?
Nope, I'm all good. Thank you.
Okay.
I did have a quick question. Thanks all for coming. In opening comments, many of you talked about what kind of the AMI target that you're targeting, and I was wondering if you could just quickly, one by one, kind of tell me what your target AMI percentage is in your product normally, you know, generally speaking.
actually defer to the developers that have been in that part of the business more than a year on this one.
We have probably 3 different products that we offer: a 0 to 30% AMI, a 30 to 50, and a 50 to 60. And those can be blended, but those are typically, they work best individually.
Those individually.
And we're generally market rates are greater than 100%.
Yeah.
We do have some affordable that we're providing in the 80 to 100, but that's a very small segment.
Homestead Community Land Trust does up to 80% home ownership. As I mentioned, I also work with Congregations for the Homeless. They are at 30% or below on the AMI.
I'd say the numbers sort of move with the market, but I can tell you that in Seattle, we've done, with their program there, with the full tax abatement, we've done 20% of the units at, I think it ranges anywhere from, Mike might have to help me out, but let's call it 65 to 85%, but you get a property tax abatement for 12 years. And then in, a jurisdiction like, Redmond, 5% at 50, or 5% of homes at 50%, or 10% at 70 or 80, seems to work. But I think anything more than that, it's harder in this market. If costs were a little bit lower, then it'd probably be easier to do. But it moves, and that's the other hard thing, right? Is you set a number, and a year later it can be off. And I don't know how to adjust for that, other than maybe the incomes will change. But just one word of caution is that does move. The other thing I want to note is in our developments, we build or we're required to build to the same standard as our market rate, units. So everything we put into the market rate units goes into the, X% of the AMI units. And just another note, today's standards for apartments are much higher than you would probably believe unless you actually set foot in it. My wife even says you build nicer stuff in their house, and I think that's just the way the market is now. Their shoe boxes are really small. You don't get 1,500 square feet anymore, but that is a market movement that's happening. It's just all the units are smaller, and that's how the affordability is the spec level and the quality has risen, but the size is like this, and maybe you get a parking spot and you have to pay for parking. So that's the way the market is right now for rental.
King County Housing Authority is, I think, a little bit unique in that we work in a much broader spectrum of affordability through the different programs and development activities we do. So through our Section 8 program, we're going to serve households that are typically between 12 and 18% of the AMI. Folks that often can't even afford a 30% rent. And sometimes it's easier. We can talk about 30% of AMI, 50%, but sometimes it's almost easier to think about, but who is that? And so you have a senior citizen who has a $700 Social Security benefit. They're going to be about 12% of the area median income. And so one of the ways that the Housing Authority is trying to respond to the market forces is we have what are called payment standards. And those are amounts of which that if someone wants to rent an apartment in a specific area, if the rent is above that level, we aren't able to provide subsidy for that apartment. So if you have a whole lot of apartments in a community that go above that, or their rents are above our payment standards, it starts to limit even the folks who may have been in that area and are already living in that area with a Section 8 rental assistance who would have to potentially move. So we've changed our approach. We now have a multi-tier, kind of by a zip code based geographic area where we are able to drill down more on what are the rents in different areas, so that as rents have gone up over on the east side, we've been able to increase our payment standards in that area, whereas other parts of the county, maybe in South County where they haven't gone up quite as fast, we're able to keep them a little bit lower there. So we're going to try to, your rent subsidies are the only way that people who are below 30% or your 12 to 18% of AMI range can get an apartment. Then there's the 30% to 50 to 60% of AMI folks, and we serve those folks typically through our tax credit housing. That's a lot of what Catholic Community Services and some of the programs RAND has worked with. And that's a program that Arch is super knowledgeable about and does a great job at when they're working with their partners in supplementing that program and leveraging the tax credit program as well as the Arch funds and often other funds to do that. Then we have what we call our workforce housing, which is not tax credit housing, but typically serves folks in the 60 to 80% of AMI range, and under state law, when we acquire housing, we can own housing, but at least 50% of the units need to be available and affordable to folks at 80% of the AMI. But most people don't realize that most renters are actually below 80% of the AMI. There are a lot of low-income folks who think they're working hard, or they're a two-person household, or a three-person or four-person, and they don't think of themselves as low income, but by definition they are. So, but we also serve people, allow people to live in those properties who have higher incomes. And again, we recognize that most people don't want to make a career out of living in kind of a modest apartment, but it's a very important stepping stone to be able to buy, a home or move into their first home ownership opportunity or pay off their school debt or otherwise.
Okay, we'll move on to the last question. Who wants to start? You want to start with Jenna? Because you.
Sure. So the question, what would city officials? Well, I think what's probably, in my mind, the most important is in the area we live, the cost of land is quite high. The cost of development is quite high. So to bring a home to market, it's actually much more expensive than I think the city officials and decision makers might realize. And so that's why I always kind of come back to being very diligent about the development standards, the impact fees that are created, and always feel free to reach out to the industry to better understand why those costs are the way they are, so you understand why when a home comes to market, it's at X price. And it really starts at the land value. And that's your citizen. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things that I'd like to share. First is investment and resources, and the more that individual communities can give into the Arch Housing Trust Fund, or at the state level, the Washington State, or the Housing Trust Fund at the state level, those dollars are highly leveraged, sometimes up to 10 to 1. So every dollar that you guys put in there, you can find state money, county money, and federal tax credit money that leverages investors from Wall Street and other places to invest in housing here in our communities. So that is a really important thing to note. Secondly is the need for having multifamily zoned land. The need for multifamily zoned land, especially in Washington, given the restrictions on condominiums, oftentimes means multifamily rental housing. Rental housing in the United States is critically important. More than half of renters in the United States are people of color, and without having rental housing, you can be excluding people of color. And so it's a hidden exclusionary tactic, and that's a way that many communities build gates around themselves and aren't inclusive. And then third, the pressures in the state are currently really pushing more and more people into homelessness. I was at a conference last week on homelessness, and a state demographer, and you might have probably talked about this in your previous planning sessions, but over the last 10 years, the state as a whole is at about 110,000 unit deficit of housing, of the influx of people into the state and the number of housing units that are created. And for every $100 rent goes up, homelessness increases 33%. And so with that demand for housing going up, it's creating rental increases, which is increasing homelessness. And so the more strategies, any of the strategies that you incorporate are going to be helpful to avoid homelessness.
Thank you.
We have a supply problem going on here. Right now, we're producing 3 jobs for every 1 housing unit that we produce. So I guess I just suggest to please keep that in mind as we're looking at regulations, as we're looking at zoning to increase densities, as you're feeling the pressure from people resisting change as they don't like seeing that additional density come. But if we're going to solve the problem, we really have to free up the supply side so that the homes can be there for people. Regulation, additional needless regulation really constrains that. And so be very, not that we do need regulation, but be cautious as you consider new regulation. And I think you have to be aggressive with zoning to provide the densities that are necessary to meet those growth targets.
I think that housing is changing. I think the 1 house per acre is a thing of the past, obviously, and people are now willing to live in a small apartment if it's nice and if it's luxurious and if they can walk to their coffee shop and if they can go to the library and if they can pick up an Uber so they don't have to have a car. And I think that attitude will prevail here in the suburbs too, especially if you create communities that have those features. And you know, maybe you should take a look and project that you're going to have a double population in 30 years and work your way back, and what does it take to do that? It's going to take some very creative thinking, and it's going to take a proactive government that is pro-development and not slow growth or not exclusionary. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a few takeaways. I think contrary to to a lot of belief, development is really hard. I know that you know, people are frustrated with the traffic and noise, and oh, this used to be something else, but it is really hard, especially now. You know, projects are difficult, and neighbors are out, and then jurisdictions are imposing a lot more requirements, and then, you know, this and that and this and that. And so what's happened is early in the business cycle is a lot easier because everybody wanted stuff to get done. And then now there's, you know, a few people who don't want development just as a general sort of rule. And so my comment is if we want to, you know, have more affordable workforce housing, you know, continue to look for ways to make things easier. You know, as market rate developers, it's pretty simple. Land is being offered to us. We look and see what could be built, how we can build it, what are the rules, and if we like it, then we'll try to do it. If not, then we'll either wait for something or move on to the next, you know, city or opportunity. And so whatever could be done to make it easier and cost-effective on the developer, just as a general rule, would promote more opportunities for development, especially in an affordable area. I want to stress the zoning code probably a little bit more, just because we don't have the flexibility to do a lot of things. We are given rules and we follow it. I mean, that's what we do. And so, yeah, we can determine what type of finishes or amenities or this or that, but we can't determine height, we can't determine density, we can't determine allowable use. We can't determine, you know, do we have to, you know, go through one city meeting or 15? And so we actually don't have a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? A lot of authority to do a lot of things, even though we may, often get blamed for certain things. And so, whatever that zoning code is, sometimes you want to set the rule and you want it to be strict, but at the same time, if it's too strict and it just makes everyone, sort of move to another direction, you got to be a little bit careful about how flexible you want it, how flexible you don't want it. But I would say that generally speaking, a zoning code, will follow. So any focus on that would be good. And then any focus on I don't know if there's any city-owned properties or any, again, a case study on one little intersection as to what is the best vision. I think, exercises like that, especially at result, everybody here does something a little bit different, and we'll all have an opinion. But I think an exercise like that might make it a little more tangible. Again, just my opinion. It has to be somebody's property, so it gets a little bit prickly. But I think something like that may be helpful to establish a vision.
So other than housing, and that we're all interested in creating housing, I think the one other thing that is common between the 6 of us here is that we're all numbers people. Because in each of our businesses, we start with the end in mind, and we work our way backwards to determine if it's feasible. So your for-profit developer, home builder is going to take a look at what can be built. And they're going to look at what it's going to cost them to acquire the land, do the construction, the cost to finance it along the way, and will they hit their return targets? In doing so, will they make money? Is it a non-starter? On the affordable housing side, we take a look at what the opportunities are, maybe what the incomes we're trying to serve. We take the revenue that we can project from that. We subtract the cost of what it's going to take to operate, and we know what revenue stream we have left over to leverage debt, and we try to figure out what's our gap that we've got to fill. And then that's how we work with Arch. Arch works with its nonprofit developers and try to figure out how do we then cover the gap. That's what we call the hole, the financing hole, that we need. And so we're all looking at these same things. And to that end, housing has become, and it will continue to be, such a huge issue in all of the county, and especially in your community, that I would strongly encourage you to spend time to understand how it works. And sit down, you could sit down with any person here and they could walk you through kind of how they look at their business model. Arch is an incredible resource, but every single strategy that is listed here, the real issue is you look at it and say, okay, well, then what will that do? What will that save? What would that, and then how does that financially impact? Does it increase the number of units? Okay, well, why is increased density an issue? And can you answer that? Do you understand financially how that affects the project when you can take the same land cost and now develop more units over the same amount of land, and all of a sudden your cost for the land went from $60,000 per unit to 50 to 40 to 20, and but you need to understand how all those pieces works. What does it mean to leverage debt? How does the interest rate environment affect the ability of what folks are doing? And so I would strongly encourage you, and you've been asking great questions and clarifications, but to really understand how these different financing models work so that you understand as you're weighing some of these things of why they make a difference and how it makes a difference.
Thank you. Okay, well, I am very appreciative for all of you for coming tonight. We've been talking about all of these strategies, and we have been talking about how many there are and how to focus and how to narrow. And personally, I've gotten some really good ideas about where to focus from this group. And like I said, we talk about this, but I feel like we talk about it out of context, and hearing from you all puts it into context. So thank you very much. It's really helpful.
I don't think so. I think they were very thorough. I really enjoyed it. I I got a lot out of it. Thank you.
Okay.
Chair Collins, do you mind if I ask a question?
Please.
Because I found this incredibly enlightening as well. So one thing from a planning standpoint as staff, when we talk about density, density has come up quite a bit tonight. When we talk about density, I find that planners get caught up in talking about the numbers behind density. You say R4 and we think we know what it means, but it means something else to somebody else. Have you encountered any other jurisdictions that communicate about density in a very effective manner? I guess that was a dud of a question. I apologize, but it's always kind of sorry.
I mean, I guess I can't say I've memorized what's allowable in R4, but as long as it's clear on the city website, a little chart or something like that, those are useful tools. So my guess is it's probably there, but I haven't memorized R4, sorry.
The only thing I might add is, in North Bend, we had a zoning code that the zone was 4 dwelling units per acre, but based on all the regulations that went into it, you really can't get to 4. So as the planner, I always felt like people came in with an expectation that they could get to 4, and then they applied all the rules, and they were, oh, we only get this. So whether it was the property owner trying to figure out what he could do or she could do with their property, or the developer. And so I actually evolved to the point where I felt like maybe defining your zones based on density was irrelevant. It was defining it based on the standards you want to have. And that dictates look, feel, vibe, your lot sizes, lot widths, everything. And ultimately, you get to the same thing. It's just maybe less in your face as like, oh, this is going to have 8 DUs per acre, versus. So we ended up kind of going to, and I've seen, I think maybe Kirkland actually talks about their zones in lot sizes. So it's like R 7.5, which is 7,500 square feet per, and that might take away that density.
Interesting.
I think the simplicity in finding, if it's in the name, that's good. So either the number of how big square footage, or number of feet tall. In Seattle and Bellingham, it's a C or a MR, some number, and that's number of feet. And then kind of going down those levels of simplicity of very clearly putting it out and not have it be in planner speak, which is very helpful once we get into the weeds of it. But just the quick of, you see the email that pops up that somebody's marketing a site, that we all probably get, and if we can quickly, I haven't developed in this community yet, what does that look like? If you can quickly grab it to see if that's something, do I want to dig into it a little bit more, is helpful.
Thank you.
I think you're already a step closer with being net density rather than gross, because you don't have that ability to cluster density, and so you're closer to it. It's just you have some significant design regulations that make it difficult to achieve that density. So you're not getting to a 4 unit per acre density. So I guess you're already going down that path where, say, King County it's a much bigger disparity.
I have a question I'd like to pose to Aaron specifically. You probably don't know this, but we ran a bus tour of housing through Redmond, Bellevue, Kirkland last night. And one of the places we showed off was Sequoia Glen in Redmond. And what we wanted to highlight there was that Toll Brothers had incorporated into that community both detached single-family homes, triplexes, of which mixed, affordable, and market rate units, and cottages. Thank you, Steve. And my question is, what made that decision for the company to try that, and what can cities do? maybe I should also ask, how successful has it been from your standpoint? And what could cities do to encourage more of that kind of thing?
Okay. So the affordable housing that we had there was a result of mandatory affordable housing requirements in Redmond. The mix of uses or mix of product type, that is a result of, one, flexibility in Redmond's standards, that they had things like a concept where you could have a triplex as long as it looks like it is one large home. That was part of Redmond's, North Redmond standards that they had at the time. Redmond also has a very successful unit lot subdivision element to their code, which is a good alternative to, it's not as good as having good condominium rules, but it's kind of the next best thing that supports attached townhouses that can have, it gives you flexibility. And if you're going to do a unit lot subdivision code, they've done a great job of making it very flexible. As you know, to contrast, City of Bothell has a unit lot subdivision code or something similar that no one has used because it wasn't written in a way that gave you the flexibility to be able to, it has problems with lot coverage and impervious for really narrow lots. And so if you go down that route, I'd be happy to expand on that more. But that, I think that answers your question.
That's Redmond's unit lot subdivision code?
Yes.
Did you say? Okay. Interesting. Thank you. I have a question. I think this might be for King County Housing Authority, maybe, or anyone who wants to answer, who knows the
Could you put it in a multiple choice, true or false?
Sorry. And so I want to know where you think the greatest need is in terms of percentage of AMI, and not in terms of need, in terms of, I guess, volume of need. Like, how could we serve the most people? Which bracket, if we target one bracket, which bracket could serve the most amount of people?
I think if there was a significant number of more multifamily apartment units that were not the luxury apartments, they create a space that can house the largest spectrum of folks. Because again, your folks with vouchers can have an opportunity to live there.
To live there.
Your folks, if there's we will work with cities, especially on the east side, and often work through Arch as well to sometimes project-based some vouchers in units over on the east side or apartments, so that there are some, and a project basing is where some of these vouchers actually reside with the unit. The rent subsidy sticks with the unit and not with the individual. So as tenants move in and move out, they can pay a rent that they can afford. You know, that single mom who's working in the grocery section at QFC with 2 kids, you know, can't, you know, may need a rent supplement, you know, to be able to afford the rent. Again, it creates a space where, you know, 2 or 3 folks who are single individuals who on their own couldn't afford an apartment can share a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment. You got a family of 4, you know, that both parents are working but only making $18 an hour each, and so they can only afford a $1,500 a month rent or $1,800. So that's the kind of thing, rather than just focusing on one type of housing. And then there are ways, again, in terms of some of the things that Arch has done, where it doesn't have to, you know, one community, what looks like a community, can actually have ownership structures within that actually then also provide for specific levels of affordability. But I think that broad range of that multifamily.
Do you think that's the workforce housing that you mentioned, like the 60 to 80% AMI, and then you can get the vouchers if they make less? Is that kind of where you're talking about?
So your workforce housing is just typically your housing that's market rate. Generally speaking, there may not be a lot of other subsidy, you know, involved in the property, and but again, it may be a component of the overall community was financed using low-income housing tax credits, so it can be a portion that serves households below 60%, while at the same time, another portion serves folks at 80 to 150% median.
Right. Okay, thank you.
And I think that those units are possible. Steve mentioned that the market demands that, but I think the capital markets demand that. The REITs that invest in large apartment buildings demand that because that creates the rate of return they need in the rentals, but it's not, I mean, people looking for rental units are just looking for a vacant unit that accepts their application. And so I think that there is a way, if there was more available property to develop in those ways, it wouldn't just be at that highest cap rate return. You could have people being willing to take a little bit lower rate of return and create that market unit that then could take a lift from other policies at the state level, like the source of income discrimination bill that just passed, and have people with not being discriminated against with the vouchers, with alimony, with child support, using those that people have been alienated from rental markets, and you would have owners who would abide by those rules and have more inclusive apartment complexes.
We're working on a development right now that Arch is actually involved with as well in Issaquah, where it will in total be about 350 units of housing. And it will be built in such that one of the apartment sections will be owned by a private developer who is using equity financing through the Laird Norton Trust, or, so it's a private equity group, and debt, and they'll have some units at 80% to get the multifamily tax exemption. But the units are targeted with rents between, I think, probably like $2,200 and $2,800 or $3,000 a month. Next to that, we will have a building that, through condominium structure, again, not individual condominium units, but the buildings being essentially condominium. So we will own one, of which it will be financed using or leveraging low-income housing tax credits, debt from financing, bonds that we will issue, tax-exempt bonds that King County Housing Authority will issue, some funding from Arch, and some funding from the county. So we will be focusing on households 60% essentially of median and below. And we will have a portion of those units where we will have some project-based rental assistance in there as well. So we'll be able to serve an even lower level of income folks who we can set their rent essentially based on what they can afford, but there will be a rental subsidy that comes into the ownership structure so that the debt can be serviced on the financing, et cetera. So that's an example of where it's a very broad range, of housing.
Thank you.
I have a question. Was that second building, did you say condos?
They're not condominium units, the entire structure.
Looks like it.
So the condominium essentially just creates a separate ownership shell. So
I see. For the whole thing?
for the whole thing. So one condo will be 150 units and one condo will be 200 units.
I was wondering, I can't see that far. Rand Redlin,
Redlin.
is that it? You prefer the condominium and the ownership for affordable, is that right?
I think I support condominiums both for affordable and for market rate. I think
But that's home ownership and not rental.
But yeah, home ownership.
I know, home ownership. So when you have a condominium for, who are you serving? What AMI are you serving with that?
So Homestead serves between 50 and 80% AMI. So somebody that's a 3-person household that family could earn up to $57,000 a year, and they would be able to afford one of our units. So it would be 2 household income people making $20 an hour. They could buy a home under our program.
So the same income level could either rent with King County, or they could buy with your program. So what would be the difference? Would they not be able to qualify? Is that why they would rent, or is it to their advantage to buy, or is it to their advantage to rent?
Well, we think that homeownership is a way for people to better themselves. And we like to believe that people in the 40, 50, and up to 80% can afford to be homeowners and create an estate for themselves. It's one of the best way to get stabilization. A typical home that we provide would probably be less per month than renting in a market rate apartment that Steve would build. But ours take a little bit of subsidy to drive down our prices in order for that affordability level.
They take a lot of subsidy, which is why understanding kind of financially how these models work, so that you understand, to get affordable home ownership, why does it cost so much, and how much, is it essentially going to take of public funds or other funding to come in and fill that gap to get it down to a level that a person making $57,000 a year can afford the mortgage. You'll find that it's more for that, for home ownership, than it is for rental. But it's still, with rental, there's a gap as well, but to understand that.
Thank you.
Okay, in the interest of time, I think we better do the public comment. It's up to you all if you would like to stay for public comment or if you'd like to leave. I think we only have one person speaking tonight, but would you like to stay or would you like to go?
Thank you, I might head out.
Yeah,
Thank you.
please, go for it. Thank you
Just
all. Thank
wanted
you
to say
again.
thank you all
Thank
so
you
much.
so
That was
much.
extremely
Really
helpful.
appreciate it.
And really appreciate the time that you take to.
Thank you. Okay, so with that, I will open public comment. And this is public comment on the actual agenda item, which is Sammamish Homegrown. Okay. Perfect.
All right. Good evening, Planning Commissioners. My name, Paul Stickney. I'm at 504 228th Ave Southeast. And I've handed out to you this evening my comment from the 524 meeting that I have put into print along with the handouts that were associated with that comment. And this evening's comment isn't on that, other than my comments tonight. This is a tad confusing. All support what's in that package. So I have a few ad libs and some interesting things. I went to the Realtor Annual Issues Housing brief yesterday at the Maidenbower Bay that was for elected officials. And they do allow any, Realtor member to go, and I have been for a long time. So I got to hear just an outstanding presentation. And at the end of the meeting, I picked up a few extra of these, and I'm going to give a copy to the city and a couple of the council members, but it was pretty amazing. And to summarize it, it's a lot of what was said here this evening. Their goal was to restore affordability and build strong communities. Those are two good things combined. And they're talking about immediate action, not waiting for comp plans on 8-year cycles. I mean, you can update a comp plan on an annual cycle. And one of the state legislators there, Tana Shane, I'm not sure how to say her name, 41st, was telling a heck of a story. Her husband, their kids are almost gone, and her husband said to her, honey, we should sell our house and we ought to downsize. And she said that she turned to him with this incredulous look and said, and go where? This was the question here at this meeting, was about affordability for all economic segments, which is what I have been chatting about. And the issue is, one isn't more important than the other. The question is, what's the need and want in each economic segment? And that's what I have been working on with the city to attempt to get that information into our comp plan so we can address internal needs for all economic segments, not to meet every need, not to meet every want, but to know what every need is and to know what the wants are and have that influence our housing policies. I am 100% certain that relative to internal needs, we have a vast oversupply of large single family and a vast undersupply of smaller and different houses. I'm also convinced that our needs shortages in Sammamish are well over 70% of the total, well above 100% AMI, not in the 400 to 500 range, but in the 200% AMI, 300% AMI, as the and go where happens over cycles of life. So I don't like to, I understand a lot of politics. There's a ton of issues. I mean, it's just unreal, all the meetings I've gone to. I get it. But I think we need the information to know and influence internal housing. There were a couple other state senators there, Guy Palumbo and Joe Fain, excellent speakers. And Guy came to speak at Romero de Valderrama's course at Central Washington University, which I attended on growth. So I got to hear him twice. Now, I'm not going to say this is a fact. I'm going to say it as it's what I understand now. The legislature is not looking to go R6 because they said that the local control pushback from across the state of you can't tell us that is really moving away from next year's legislative bill not going to R6. Where it's headed, though, is in some other interesting ways. They're going to come up with some sort of internal triggers to measure affordability requirements of each city and come up with standards with Commerce of how to figure it out. I'm advocating that we get ahead of that curve, and they are going to do mandatory solutions that they don't know what they are yet. They're seeking them. The other thing is they're really going to focus on putting housing on either transit rails, whether it be regular metro or ST3 or whatever, near transit. They're also going to work on cities that haven't taken their fair share over time of growth. So it was very interesting, and they're talking about comp plans moving to 50-year horizons to figure out longer-term cycles of life. It was just an extraordinary meeting, and there's some awesome information in here. Switching to the little packet I handed out this evening, at the end of that, I talk about going 1 to 2 years back and then 1 to 2 months forward. 1 to 2 years back, I'm going to send you a PDF of this. This is Achieving Housing Affordability Through Balanced Sustainable Housing in Sammamish. Was turned in June of 2016. There's a long story behind why and what on the timing, but I'll fill you in on that when we meet individually, not here. There are 5 sections in this book, all important, but one is really important because it goes into clear specifics as to why the internal housing needs within Sammamish are 2 to 4 times greater than the size of our regional growth target. And Sammamish is extremely unique. Our internal needs, not that we have to meet them all, but they do exist, 2 totally different things. Our internal needs are far greater than our external growth target, and most cities don't have that issue because their growth targets are larger, their housing supply is more balanced, and their economic and their demographic groups are more balanced. We're askew in all the other 3, which cause us to have internal needs that are greater than our growth target. And the growth target is not a cap, it's not a ceiling, it's a floor, and it does not contemplate internal needs and wants. The Office of Financial Management, King County, PSRC did not come here and do a needs analysis or do a survey. So those are things in my comment. And so that's the real issue, is that the growth target does not measure internal needs. It may have intended to cover them in some broad, long-range forecast method, but it doesn't know the specifics. And we have just an awesome opportunity to meet internal needs, do it positively in centers, and actually increase all AMI categories in our centers for smaller and different housing, and to lessen the oversupply of large single-family home, have our cake, eat it too, improve the community, meet future growth targets, and meet needs internally. A lot more to come, and I will be in touch.
Thank you for your comment. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak tonight? Okay, seeing none, I'll close the public comment section. The next item of business, oh, looks like Doug wants to talk.
Chair Collins, just one quick thing. I think Arthur would like to make one quick point on next steps.
Yes, please.
Turn it over to Arthur.
Sorry, we kind of skipped that when I dismissed everybody.
Okay.
Good evening. So you got handed out to you tonight a matrix, and what we tried to do here, and I think Doug's done a good job of summarizing what we tried to do here. But I think I just wanted to re-emphasize that this is our attempt to take your last conversation and change it, and then we've got it in red line so you can see how we've changed it, so that you can follow all of that. So hopefully you can look at that, and we're hoping you have time to look at it prior to the July meeting so we can do more cleanup and things along those lines. And so this is sort of an iterative process where we listen to you, we try to interpret it and put it in here. If you're good with it, then we clean it up, and then you'll respond to this next version. And so we're trying to get a little ahead of the curve because you only have a couple more meetings. That's why we gave this to you now, so that, because it is a few weeks before the next meeting, we thought this might be one way we can try to keep the ball rolling for you and make progress on this. So it is meant to fully reflect your conversations. It's not us trying to reinterpret or add stuff. And we've also tried to organize things like we were starting to do that night. We don't think we're there yet, but we're hoping this is a good step there that will help you start sorting through this in your process of getting from this long list, is all the people commented on the panel, and getting to your top priorities.
Speaking of that, if we, after what we've heard tonight, go back,
Yes.
think about the priorities, and should we talk with staff ahead of time of the next meeting, or should we save those comments for the next meeting?
So what we will do is we will be adding probably another column, and that will indicate outside input. And so we will use comments from this tonight, but as we also do some of the focus groups, we will also note. And what we've done in the past is we will try to take all the things about strategies they liked, and we'll say, did the nonprofit like it? Did the for-profit like it? Did the single family or multifamily, private like it? So that you'll be able to have that in front of you.
Okay.
And so you are doing a public hearing still, so the idea is
That's right.
it's all input at this point still. So I think you should be prepared once that hearing closes to start going back and doing exactly what you're saying. But we'll try to, for that meeting, take tonight's conversation and add it in so that you can tell exactly what their comments were and how they link up to the strategy as best we can.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Arthur.
One additional comment about.
Doug, can you actually put the slide up with the next steps?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry. I guess we should extend the meeting. Does someone want to do that? Say a motion to extend to 8:45.
Motion to extend the meeting till 8:45?
Second.
There's a motion and a second to extend the meeting to 8:45. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed?
Aye.
And the meeting has been extended to 8:45.
So
Okay, thank
this
you
is
for putting this up.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just one additional comment is the intent here is for, Arthur had mentioned the public hearing. On July 5th, we will open and close the public hearing and then carry forward the deliberations to the 19th. However, I'm guessing there's going to be some level of discussion and deliberation on the 5th as well, but did want to just make the point that the intent is to open and close the hearing on the 5th. So.
Right. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Any questions from commission? No? All right. I need a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
Second?
There's a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And opposed say no. And I adjourn the meeting at 8:30.